I am Olivia, 33 years old, and 16 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my parents decided it was the perfect time to destroy my life. We were sitting in the private dining room of one of the most exclusive steakhouses in the city, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and expensive wine. My father, Richard, leaned across the table, his face red with calculated fury, and slammed his heavy fist against the mahogany wood. The silver cutlery rattled. He pointed a shaking finger at me and announced to my fiancé Harrison that I was a liar, a sociopath, and a monster who had secretly given birth to a bastard child at 18 and abandoned it like trash. My mother, Patricia, immediately buried her face in a linen napkin, forcing out perfectly timed fake sobs while warning Harrison to run before I trapped him too. I did not scream. I did not defend myself. I just sat there in absolute silence and watched the man I loved. Harrison did not panic. He calmly took a sip of his Cabernet, reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of a smiling 15-year-old girl. He looked my father dead in the eye and asked, "Is this the child you are talking about?" When my parents froze in absolute shock, Harrison smiled. He told them that the girl in the photograph was his niece, the very same child his older sister Monica had adopted 15 years ago. Before I reveal the full details of this catastrophic dinner and the deeply hidden secrets that brought my toxic family to their knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light, no matter how deep people try to bury it. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood, appearances were the only currency that mattered to Richard and Patricia. They spent their lives meticulously crafting the illusion of the perfect wealthy American family. In their eyes, my older sister Isabella was the flawless golden child who could do no wrong, while I was simply the scapegoat, the rebellious disappointment who never quite fit their pristine mold. They thought they still held all the power over me, assuming I was still that terrified teenager they could easily bully and control. What they completely failed to realize was that I had spent the last decade building my own empire. As a multi-million-dollar developer of luxury boutique hotels, I possessed resources and a ruthless business acumen they could not even begin to fathom. I kept my wealth entirely off their radar, letting them believe I was just scraping by in middle management. That financial independence was my armor, but on this particular night, the weapon of choice belonged entirely to Harrison. The evening was supposed to be a celebratory dinner leading up to our wedding. Harrison and I had arrived at the steakhouse feeling exhausted but happy, eager to finalize the last few details of our upcoming ceremony. My parents had insisted on this gathering, claiming they wanted to properly welcome Harrison into the family. Isabella was there too, sitting next to her husband Jamal, a highly respected orthopedic surgeon whose deep sense of integrity stood in stark contrast to the rest of my biological relatives. I should have known the dinner was a trap the moment we sat down. My parents ordered the most expensive items on the menu, smiling with that predatory warmth they always used right before launching an attack. We were barely through the appetizer course when the atmosphere violently shifted. Richard suddenly set down his fork, cleared his throat loudly, and fixed his gaze directly on Harrison. The friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a stern, deeply concerned expression that I recognized instantly. It was the face he used when he was about to deliver a crushing blow. He told Harrison that as a father he could no longer stay silent in good conscience. He claimed he had a moral obligation to protect a good man from making the biggest mistake of his life. Then came the slam of his fist on the table. The sudden noise echoed off the walls of the private room. Richard raised his voice, ensuring that every word cut through the air with maximum impact. He declared that I had been hiding a dark, unforgivable secret. He told Harrison that when I was 18 years old, I had gotten pregnant, hidden the pregnancy, and then heartlessly abandoned the baby at a rural clinic because I was too selfish to take responsibility. He painted me as a cold, calculating monster who lacked basic human empathy. Right on cue, Patricia began her theatrical performance. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes welling with manufactured tears. She reached out and tried to touch Harrison's arm, her voice trembling with fake grief. She told him that it broke her heart to say these things about her own daughter, but she could not bear to see him trapped in a marriage built on lies. She warned him that someone who could throw away their own flesh and blood would eventually destroy him too. Isabella sat quietly across from me, sipping her sparkling water, a faint, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had won. They all thought they had successfully detonated a bomb that would end my relationship, isolate me completely, and put me right back under their control. The silence that followed their accusations was heavy and suffocating. Jamal looked absolutely horrified, staring at me as if he was seeing a stranger. But I did not look at him, and I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes fixed on Harrison. I had warned him about my family. I had told him how far they would go to tear me down. Still watching them actually execute this level of cruelty was staggering. Harrison did not flinch. He did not pull away from me or demand an explanation. Instead, he picked up his wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the vintage as if we were discussing the weather. His absolute calm unnerved my father. Richard shifted in his seat, his face reddening further, clearly agitated that Harrison was not reacting with the shock and disgust they had anticipated. Harrison carefully set his glass down on the white tablecloth. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew his smartphone. With a few swift swipes, he brought up a high-resolution photograph. He leaned forward and slid the phone across the smooth mahogany surface, stopping it right in front of Richard and Patricia. The screen glowed brightly, displaying a recent portrait of a beautiful 15-year-old girl with bright eyes and a wide smile. Harrison leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. He asked, "Is this the child you are talking about?" Richard stared at the screen, his mouth falling slightly open. Patricia stopped her fake crying instantly, her hands freezing mid-air. The color completely drained from their faces as they recognized the girl. They looked at Harrison, completely unable to comprehend how my fiancé possessed a current photograph of the baby they had secretly sent away a decade and a half ago. Harrison smiled, but it was a cold, razor-sharp expression that held zero warmth. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto my father. He announced that the young girl in the photograph was not a stranger. He told them her name was Lily. He then delivered the sentence that shattered their entire reality. He revealed that Lily was his niece. He explained with absolute clarity that his older sister Monica had been the one to adopt that very same baby 15 years ago. The trap my parents had so carefully set had just snapped shut on their own necks. For a fraction of a second, the only sound in the private dining room was the soft hum of the air conditioning overhead. My father stared at Harrison, his mind frantically trying to process the impossible coincidence that the man I was about to marry was the brother of the woman who adopted the secret baby. Instead of backing down, Richard doubled down. He slammed his hand on the table again, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He pointed at me, his face contorting into a mask of pure self-righteous fury. He shouted that this only proved how deeply manipulative I was. He accused me of deliberately infiltrating Harrison's family, of tracking down the child I had callously thrown away just to secure a wealthy husband. He looked at Harrison with fake sympathy, insisting that I was a parasite who had dumped my unwanted burden onto his sister Monica and was now trying to con my way into his fortune. My mother nodded vigorously, wiping away her non-existent tears. She cried out that I had always been broken, a defective daughter who lacked the maternal instinct that Isabella possessed so naturally. She begged Harrison to open his eyes, claiming my presence in his life was a calculated, sick obsession with the child I had abandoned. She wailed that I was trying to ruin their peaceful family dynamic by bringing up a shameful past they had all tried so hard to forget. I let them shout. I let them dig their graves so deep that they would never be able to climb out. When my father finally paused to catch his breath, breathing heavily in his expensive tailored suit, I calmly unclasped my designer purse. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the anger that had been simmering in my chest for a decade and a half. I simply reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of thick folded paper. I placed the document on the table and slid it precisely to the center right next to Harrison's phone, which still displayed Lily's smiling face. I told my father that he always had a remarkable talent for weaving fiction, but unfortunately for him, I preferred hard data. I instructed him to pick up the paper and read it aloud. Richard glared at me, refusing to touch the document as if it were coated in poison. Harrison, ever the calm orchestrator of their destruction, picked it up instead. He unfolded the crisp paper and began to read the official letterhead. It was a certified medical DNA analysis, conducted 15 years ago, at an independent, highly respected testing facility. Harrison read the results with a clear, unwavering voice. The report detailed a comprehensive genetic comparison between myself and the child. It concluded with absolute medical and legal certainty that I, Olivia, shared zero maternal DNA with the girl named Lily. I was biologically excluded from being the mother. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade that had just dropped. My father's face turned the color of ash. My mother clutched her chest, the theatrical performance completely vanishing, replaced by genuine suffocating panic. Isabella, who had been sitting so smugly just moments before, suddenly looked as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles turned bone white. I stood up slowly, ensuring every eye in the room was locked onto me. I addressed Harrison first, thanking him for reading the document, and then I turned my gaze entirely to my golden child sister. I announced to the room that my parents were right about one thing. A child had been born in secret 15 years ago. A baby girl had been hidden away, covered up and shipped off to avoid a massive society scandal. But I was not the mother. I detailed exactly what happened that rainy November night 15 years ago. I described the grimy rural clinic 2 towns over, a place my parents specifically chose because no one there would recognize our prominent family name. I was 18 years old, terrified and forced into the passenger seat of my father's car. I recounted how my parents had physically backed me into a corner in that sterile waiting room, threatening to cut off my college tuition, kick me out onto the street, and ruin my life if I did not do exactly as they commanded. I pointed directly at Isabella. I told the room that my sister was 20 years old at the time, a junior at a prestigious Ivy League university, deeply entrenched in an elite sorority, and engaged to a wealthy politician's son. A pregnancy would have shattered her flawless reputation. It would have ruined the perfect golden child narrative my parents had spent their entire lives cultivating. So they made me the sacrificial lamb. I explained how my parents forced me to sign the birth certificate as the biological mother. They used my name, my identity, and my future to shield Isabella from the consequences of her own actions. They orchestrated the entire private adoption, handing the baby over to an agency the very next morning, ensuring the child would vanish without a trace. They walked out of that clinic with Isabella's reputation completely intact, leaving me to carry the secret, the shame, and the legal burden of a child that was never mine. Isabella shook her head violently, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. She stammered, her voice cracking as she tried to call me a liar, but the certified DNA test sitting on the table was an immovable mountain of proof. The smirk she had worn all evening was completely eradicated. She looked at our parents silently, begging them to fix this, to weave another web of lies, but Richard and Patricia were completely paralyzed by the exposure of their ultimate crime. They had built their entire identity on being the perfect high society family, and I had just exposed them as ruthless manipulators who discarded a child to protect an image. All eyes in the room slowly shifted from the devastating DNA results to the man sitting completely paralyzed at the far end of the table. Jamal had been a silent observer until this exact second. He was a brilliant orthopedic surgeon, a man whose entire existence was anchored in uncompromising integrity and deep family values. He had built a life with Isabella under the fundamental belief that she shared his moral compass. As a devoted husband, and he had always treated me with polite distance, trusting the fabricated narrative his wife and my parents had fed him for years. They had convinced him I was a selfish, erratic outcast who could not be trusted. Now the bedrock of his reality was cracking wide open right before his eyes. Jamal stared at the crisp, certified DNA document resting next to the bright digital photograph of a 15-year-old girl. The physical resemblance between Isabella and the teenager in the picture was sudden and undeniable. The curve of the jawline, the shape of the eyes, the precise arch of the brow. It was all there, staring back at a man who was rapidly putting the grotesque pieces together. He looked at Richard and Patricia, observing their terrified, guilty silence. Then, he turned his gaze to his wife. The silence stretched, suffocating and heavy, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from Isabella. Jamal did not shout. He did not slam his fists the way my father had. His voice, when it finally broke the quiet, was remarkably steady, yet it carried a chilling, absolute coldness that made the temperature in the room plummet. He asked Isabella if it was true. He demanded to know if she had looked him in the eye every single day of their marriage, knowing she had thrown her own flesh and blood into the adoption system like a piece of unwanted trash, only to happily watch her younger sister bear the shame for 15 years. Isabella panicked. The polished, untouchable golden child facade completely shattered. She scrambled out of her chair, her expensive silk dress catching on the edge of the table, and threw herself toward her husband. She desperately grabbed his arm, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket. She began to weep, forcing heavy theatrical sobs that echoed off the private dining room walls. She told Jamal that he did not understand the pressure she was under back then. She claimed she was just a frightened college student, that our parents had forced her to make an impossible choice, and that she had buried the trauma so deeply she had convinced herself it never happened. She frantically tried to gaslight him, insisting that the past did not matter because they had a perfect life together, now a life she had protected at all costs. Jamal looked down at her hands gripping his sleeve. The revulsion on his face was absolute. He did not see a frightened victim. He saw a fraud. He saw a woman capable of discarding a newborn infant to protect her country club status. A woman capable of watching her sister endure a decade of psychological abuse just to maintain a lie. He slowly and deliberately peeled her fingers off his jacket, treating her touch as if it were a physical contaminant. He stepped back, creating a hard, insurmountable physical boundary between them. He told her that there was no justification for abandoning a child, but what truly sickened him was the malicious, calculated destruction of her own sister to cover her tracks. He stated, his voice ringing with quiet authority, that he could never share a home, a name, or a life with someone utterly devoid of a soul. He looked at my parents, shaking his head in sheer disgust at the monsters sitting at the table, and then he turned his back on them. Jamal walked out of the private dining room without looking back, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a resounding thud that signaled the absolute end of their marriage. Isabella let out a guttural, jagged scream. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire empire burn to ashes. With her husband gone and her pristine reputation annihilated, she whipped around to face me. Her sorrow instantly vanished, replaced by venomous, unhinged rage. She lunged forward, her hands slamming onto the table, screaming that I had ruined her life. She shouted that I was a jealous, vindictive parasite who had orchestrated this entire evening just to destroy her happiness because I could never equal her success. She shrieked that I would pay for humiliating her, promising to drag my name through the mud until I had nothing left. My parents quickly rallied behind their favorite daughter. Richard threatened to utterly destroy my business, promising to leverage every political connection he had to ensure I would be bankrupted and blacklisted. Patricia wailed that I was dead to them, a toxic mistake they should have cut loose years ago. They threw every threat and insult they could muster, desperate to regain some semblance of power through sheer volume and intimidation. I stood there calmly, letting their toxic venom wash over me without leaving a single mark. I reached out and gently retrieved the DNA test from the table, folding it neatly and sliding it back into my designer purse. Harrison stood up beside me, buttoning his suit jacket with effortless grace. He placed a sleek black credit card on the table to cover our portion of the meal, entirely unbothered by the screaming family across from us. He offered me his arm, his eyes filled with quiet pride and fierce protection. I looked at my sister, my father, and my mother one last time. I told them that they had spent my entire life trying to bury me, completely unaware that I was a seed. I advised them to save their breath because the war they were trying to start had already been won. I took Harrison's arm, turned my back on the screaming, disgraced family, and walked out of the steakhouse. We stepped into the crisp evening air, leaving them to suffocate in the wreckage of their own lies, fully prepared for the brutal, inevitable fallout that was about to follow. The very next morning, the brutal fallout began exactly as we anticipated. My parents were operating in a state of absolute frantic panic. Jamal had not returned to the sprawling suburban estate he shared with Isabella. He had immediately moved into a private luxury suite downtown and instructed the building security to deny Isabella entry under any circumstances. With their perfect son-in-law actively packing his bags and ignoring every hysterical phone call, Richard and Patricia knew their pristine public image was standing on the precipice of total annihilation. They needed a scapegoat to absorb the shockwave of the scandal, and they immediately fell back on their favorite familiar target: me. Before the sun even reached its peak that next day, my parents launched a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign across their elite country club circles. Patricia was ruthless. She spent the entire morning hosting emergency brunches and making tearful phone calls to the most influential wives in their high society network. She spun a masterful, completely fabricated web of lies, claiming that I was currently suffering from a severe, dangerous psychiatric break. She told everyone who would listen that I had spent the last decade harboring a deep, bitter jealousy toward Isabella because of her perfect marriage and flawless reputation. According to my mother, I had hired skilled con artists, fabricated medical documents, and manipulated Harrison into believing a deranged fantasy just to destroy my sister out of pure spite. Richard matched her efforts on the golf course and in the private smoking lounges of his elite social clubs. He cornered his wealthy friends' politicians and business partners, painting me as a vindictive, unstable woman who was desperately trying to extort money from her own family. He claimed I was holding my sister's marriage hostage, demanding a massive financial payout in exchange for dropping my insane accusations. The elite circles of our city thrived on scandal, and they eagerly consumed the narrative my parents were feeding them. By noon, the social blackout was in full effect. My phone stopped ringing. Several high-profile guests who had RSVP'd to our upcoming wedding suddenly sent cold brief emails withdrawing their attendance, citing unexpected scheduling conflicts. The owner of the prestigious floral boutique we had hired for our reception called my assistant to abruptly cancel our contract, returning the deposit without any viable explanation. Everywhere I went, the whispers followed. People I had known since childhood turned their heads when I walked into a room or crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. My family wanted me to feel entirely isolated, completely cut off from the world, and suffocated by the weight of their societal power. They wanted me to crawl back to them on my hands and knees, begging for their forgiveness and retracting every piece of the truth I had exposed at the steakhouse. They severely miscalculated. I did not shed a single tear over their social games. Harrison and I simply watched their frantic maneuvering from the penthouse balcony of my corporate headquarters, completely unfazed by the country club gossip. Social sabotage was merely the opening volley for a man like my father. Richard realized very quickly that cold shoulders and canceled floral arrangements were not going to break my resolve. He needed to hit me where he believed it would cause the most devastating immediate pain. He needed to break me financially. Richard still operated under the delusion that I was merely a moderately successful developer scraping by on bank loans and razor-thin profit margins. He had absolutely no idea about the true scale of my private wealth, but he did know about my newest, most ambitious project. I was in the middle of developing a $70 million luxury boutique hotel right in the heart of the downtown historical district. It was a massive undertaking, and construction was already moving at a rapid pace. Richard decided to leverage his decades of paying off local city council members and greasing the palms of corrupt municipal bureaucrats. On Thursday morning, my lead contractor called me in a sheer panic. Without any prior warning or valid legal justification, the city inspectors had descended upon my construction site. They slapped my property with an immediate freeze, citing a sudden barrage of anonymous environmental complaints and fabricated zoning infractions. The heavy machinery was shut down. The workers were ordered off the premises. Every single zoning permit I had spent the last 2 years securing was mysteriously suspended, pending a thorough, indefinite municipal review. Every day that massive site sat empty cost my company hundreds of thousands of dollars in contractor delays, holding costs, and material storage fees. Richard was trying to bleed me dry. He wanted to push me to the brink of total financial ruin, so I would have no choice but to surrender. Less than an hour after the site was shut down, my office phone rang. It was my father. His voice dripped with arrogant, smug satisfaction as he laid out his brutal ultimatum. He told me that the city council was filled with his close friends, and the construction freeze was just a small taste of the power he wielded. He demanded that I immediately drive directly to Jamal's private clinic, fall on my hands and knees, and confess that the entire DNA test was nothing but a malicious, jealous lie. He ordered me to fix Isabella's marriage and apologize. If I obeyed, he promised to have my permits restored by the end of the week. If I refused, he swore he would keep the site frozen until my company went bankrupt and I lost everything. I listened to his pathetic, desperate threats in absolute silence. I did not argue with him, and I certainly did not beg. I simply hung up the office phone. Richard thought he delivered the winning blow. He had no idea that by attacking my business, he had just handed me the exact justification I needed to completely annihilate his. The morning after, my father froze my construction permits. I sat at my desk in the penthouse suite of my corporate headquarters. The space was a testament to the empire I had built from nothing. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. I was quietly reviewing the revised architectural blueprints for the new luxury hotel when a sudden violently loud commotion erupted out in the previously quiet outer reception area. Before I could even reach for the intercom, the heavy glass doors to my private office flew open. They slammed against the wall with a deafening crash. Richard stormed into the room, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He was breathing heavily, his expensive silk tie slightly askew, looking every bit the entitled patriarch who genuinely believed the entire world existed simply to bend to his iron will. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, leaving us alone. Richard immediately marched across the Persian rug and slammed both of his hands down on my pristine desk. He glared down at me with absolute contempt. He told me that the game was over. He sneered, claiming that my little construction project was bleeding thousands of dollars by the hour and that I was utterly powerless to stop him. He demanded that I surrender immediately. He ordered me to schedule a public press conference before the end of the day. He demanded that I stand in front of the local media and falsely confess that I had forged the DNA test to frame Isabella out of pure jealousy. He wanted me to publicly declare that Isabella was completely innocent and that I was a disturbed, vengeful woman. But his delusional tirade did not stop there at all. Richard pointed a finger directly at my face and demanded that I call off my wedding to Harrison immediately. He stated that losing my fiancé was the only acceptable way to atone for destroying Isabella's marriage. According to his twisted logic, since Jamal had walked out on the golden child, I had no right to be happy. He expected me to sacrifice my entire future, my reputation, and my marriage just to patch up the shattered illusion of his perfect family. He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to break down in tears and agree to his insane demands. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the panic button hidden beneath the mahogany wood of my desk. Instead, I calmly closed my laptop, neatly stacked my blueprints, and stood up. I wore a tailored crimson suit that projected pure corporate dominance. I smoothed out my jacket, stepped out from behind the desk, and walked right past him. I moved toward the massive windows overlooking the downtown district, forcing him to turn around and follow me like a subordinate. I looked out at the city and told my father that he was making a fatal miscalculation. I pointed out that he had marched into my building completely blind to the reality of his situation. I explained that the intimidated, helpless 18-year-old girl he cornered in a rural clinic 15 years ago no longer existed. I told him that the teenager who used to beg for his basic affection had died the night he forced her to sign a fake birth certificate. The deep trauma he inflicted was the very catalyst that forged my relentless ambition. Every tear I shed back then was transformed into the calculated drive that built this untouchable empire. In her place stood a woman who owned half the commercial real estate he was currently looking at. I advised him to take a good hard look around my office because it was built entirely on my own merit, without a single cent of his dirty money. Richard scoffed, attempting to maintain his arrogant facade. He crossed his arms and told me that fancy offices did not change the fact that he held my zoning permits hostage. He laughed, insisting that my business would be bankrupt by the end of the month if I did not submit to his authority. I slowly turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I picked up a sleek, unmarked black folder that I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I walked back over to my father and pressed the heavy folder directly against his chest, forcing him to take it. I kept my voice perfectly level and icy cold. I told him that I was giving him exactly 24 hours to lift the freeze on my construction permits. I instructed him to call his corrupt friends on the city council and make the problem disappear by tomorrow morning. If he failed to do so, the contents of that folder would become his new reality. Richard gripped the folder, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he looked down at the black cover. He tried to muster a threatening tone, demanding to know what garbage I was trying to hand him. I did not raise my voice, but my words carried the weight of absolute destruction. I told him that he was about to learn a very painful lesson about corporate warfare. I warned him that he should review those documents carefully before he ever tried to threaten me in my own building again. I slowly walked over to the heavy glass doors, pulled them open, and gestured to the waiting security guards. I told my father that our meeting was over and that he knew the way out. Richard opened his mouth to shout another insult, but the icy, unbothered look in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. He realized, perhaps for the very first time in his entire life, that he had no control over me whatsoever. He tightened his grip on the black folder, his face pale with sudden, unexplainable dread, and walked out of my office in complete silence. I did not even make it to the elevator. Through the thick glass walls of my office, I watched his heavy footsteps slow down and eventually stop in the middle of the reception area. His massive ego simply could not tolerate the idea of retreating. I saw him violently tear open the black folder, his eyes scanning the first page. For a moment he stood perfectly still. Then a loud, booming laugh echoed across the marble floors of the lobby. It was that familiar, condescending bark he always used to belittle me when I was a teenager. He spun around, pushed past the bewildered security guards, and marched right back into my private suite. He threw the black folder onto my desk, sending the neatly stacked papers scattering across the polished mahogany. He sneered, his face relaxing into a mask of pure arrogance. He told me that I was a pathetic, delusional amateur for trying to scare him with fake financial records. He claimed that whoever forged those documents for me did a terrible job because the numbers were utterly ridiculous. He proudly declared that his real estate company was currently backed by Apex Vanguard Holdings, one of the most ruthless and powerful private equity firms on the East Coast. He boasted that he had just secured a massive line of credit from them to keep his commercial properties afloat, and that the board of directors at Apex respected him too much to ever pull their funding. I remained standing by the window, watching his chest puff out with unearned pride. I slowly walked back to my desk, picked up the scattered papers, and tapped them neatly into a perfect stack. I told my father that his arrogance was exactly why his company was currently bleeding millions of dollars a quarter. I pointed out that he had spent the last 2 years mismanaging his commercial assets to fund Isabella's lavish lifestyle and Patricia's country club charity galas. I recited his exact debt-to-income ratio, a number so highly classified that only his chief financial officer should have known it. Richard blinked, the smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. He demanded to know how I obtained his private corporate financials. He accused me of hacking his servers or bribing an entry-level accountant. He shouted that no matter what fabricated numbers I held in my hand, I was nothing but a failed daughter playing dress-up in a rented office. He reiterated that Apex Vanguard Holdings had his back, and they would crush anyone who tried to interfere with his business operations. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and folded my hands on the desk. I kept my voice entirely conversational, stripped of any emotion. I told him to look closely at the second page of the document he had just thrown at me. I explained that it was a certified corporate hierarchy chart. I broke down the complex web of shell companies, holding groups, and offshore accounts that shielded the true ownership of Apex Vanguard Holdings. I watched his eyes dart toward the paper, but his stubborn pride prevented him from picking it up again. So I narrated the reality for him. I explained that Apex Vanguard was not run by a board of faceless old money investors. It was a subsidiary of a larger holding company, which was wholly owned by a single private LLC. I leaned forward and told him that I was the sole proprietor, president, and majority shareholder of that LLC. I was Apex Vanguard. I was the invisible entity that bought out his massive, toxic debt 2 years ago when every traditional bank in the city had denied his loan applications. I owned every single mortgage on his commercial properties, and I held the exclusive rights to call in those loans at any time. Richard let out another harsh laugh, but this time it sounded thin and incredibly strained. He gripped the edge of my desk, shaking his head. He accused me of being a pathological liar, echoing the exact same words he used against me at the steakhouse. He dared me to prove it. He challenged me, stating that if I really controlled his primary creditor, I should go ahead and pull the plug right now. He was absolutely convinced that I was bluffing, betting his entire financial future on the deeply ingrained belief that I was still weak, incapable, and entirely beneath him. I did not argue. I simply reached across my desk and picked up the sleek black multi-line telephone. I hit the speaker button, the sharp dial tone cutting through the tense silence of the room. I punched in a direct extension and waited. The phone rang exactly twice before it was picked up. A crisp, professional voice filled the office, answering as the Chief Executive Operations Manager for Apex Vanguard Holdings. I did not take my eyes off my father. I identified myself using my executive authorization code. I issued a direct, immediate, and irrevocable order. I instructed my manager to execute a total freeze on all active credit lines associated with Richard's real estate development firm. I cited a critical breach of financial covenants, a clause I had specifically embedded in his loan contracts 2 years ago for this exact moment. I ordered the immediate suspension of his operational funds and authorized the legal department to begin the process of calling in his commercial loans in full by the end of the business day. The manager on the speakerphone did not hesitate. He simply replied that the executive order was understood and the credit freeze was being executed across all banking platforms immediately. He confirmed that Richard's corporate accounts would be locked down within the next 60 seconds. I thanked him and pressed the button to end the call. The silence that descended upon my office was absolute and utterly suffocating. Richard stood perfectly still, his hands still gripping the edge of my desk. He opened his mouth to speak, to hurl another insult, to tell me that the phone call was just an elaborate theatrical stunt. But before a single word could leave his throat, the heavy silence was shattered by a sharp, vibrating buzz. It was his cell phone, tucked inside the breast pocket of his expensive suit. Richard slowly reached inside and pulled the phone out. He stared at the screen. The caller ID flashed the name of his chief financial officer. He swiped to answer, bringing the phone to his ear with a trembling hand. Because the room was so quiet, I could hear the frantic, panicked voice of his executive spilling out of the earpiece. The CFO was shouting that their primary bank accounts had just been locked. I was hyperventilating, explaining that payroll would bounce, vendor checks were bouncing, and Apex Vanguard had just issued a notice of default. I watched the devastating reality crash into my father in real time. The arrogant, untouchable sneer that had defined his face for my entire life completely dissolved. His shoulders slumped, and the aggressive posture he used to dominate every room he entered totally collapsed. His face turned a sickly shade of gray as the blood drained from his cheeks. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering against the hard mahogany surface of my desk. Absolute paralyzing terror washed over his eyes. He looked at me, no longer seeing the scapegoat daughter he could manipulate and discard at will. He finally realized that he was staring at the ultimate architect of his financial ruin. The disappointment daughter he had gleefully humiliated just days ago was now his biggest, most unforgiving creditor. And I was not going to show him a single ounce of mercy. While my father stumbled out of my corporate headquarters as a financially ruined man, the shockwave of my credit freeze violently slammed into my sister. Isabella was already suffocating in a rapidly shrinking reality. Jamal had completely ghosted her. He ignored her frantic text messages, blocked her calls, and had his private security team turn her away at the lobby of his downtown luxury suite. Her marriage, the absolute crown jewel of her perfect high society image, was dead in the water. Without Jamal's impressive income, she desperately needed our parents' wealth to maintain her lavish lifestyle. But the moment my father's business accounts were locked down, the family credit cards Isabella heavily relied on were instantly declined at high-end boutiques across the entire city. The golden child was entirely out of options, out of money, and rapidly running out of time. The walls were closing in on her fabricated kingdom, leaving her desperate to secure a brand new lifeline before her financial destruction became public knowledge. A narcissist, deprived of their primary supply, will always ruthlessly hunt for a new target to drain. Isabella quickly realized that Jamal was a lost cause and my parents were financially paralyzed. So she aimed her desperate sights on the biggest, wealthiest mark left on the board, my fiancé. She foolishly believed that Harrison was just another easily manipulated rich man who could be swayed by dramatic tears and a pretty face. She assumed that underneath his calm analytical exterior, he must harbor serious doubts about the catastrophic scandal at the steakhouse. Isabella decided that her absolute best survival strategy was to seduce Harrison, break our upcoming engagement, and secure his massive investment fund portfolio entirely for herself. She viewed him not as a person, but as a shiny new lifeboat that could carry her far away from the sinking wreckage of our family. She paid a valet at Harrison's corporate building to track his daily evening routine. On Friday night, Harrison was sitting alone in the dimly lit, ultra-exclusive mahogany bar at the Grand Monarch Hotel. He was quietly reviewing international financial portfolios over a single glass of aged scotch. Isabella orchestrated her ambush flawlessly. She walked into the private bar wearing a deeply plunging emerald silk dress that clung to her frame and left absolutely nothing to the imagination. She bypassed the hostess stand entirely and slid directly onto the empty leather bar stool right next to Harrison. She let out a dramatic trembling sigh, pretending she had just accidentally stumbled into him while seeking a quiet refuge from the overwhelming stress of the past few days. Harrison did not flinch. He simply closed his leather portfolio, took a slow sip of his scotch, and turned to face her. His expression remained an unreadable mask of polite, calm interest. He allowed her to initiate the conversation, knowing perfectly well that her sudden appearance in his private establishment was calculated and lacking any genuine spontaneity. Isabella took his calm silence as an eager invitation. She ordered a dirty martini and immediately launched into the theatrical performance of a lifetime. She leaned in uncomfortably close, ensuring the heavy scent of her expensive perfume washed over him. She began to weep, forcing perfectly synchronized tears to spill over her carefully contoured cheeks. She cried that Jamal had ruthlessly abandoned her over a massive, cruel misunderstanding that I had deliberately orchestrated. Then, she seamlessly pivoted her venomous attack directly toward me. She whispered, her voice shaking with fake vulnerability, that she was terrified for Harrison's physical and emotional safety. She claimed that I was a clinical psychopath who had spent my entire life deeply obsessing over her success. According to her new twisted narrative, the DNA test was completely fabricated by my dark web connections. She painted me as a deeply disturbed, jealous monster who was plotting to drain Harrison's financial accounts the minute we signed the marriage certificate. She reached out and placed her manicured hand gently over his, tracing his knuckles with her thumb. She lowered her voice to a seductive conspiratorial purr. She told Harrison that he deserved a real woman from a proper pedigree, not the broken, vindictive spare part of the family. She explicitly offered herself as the superior alternative, promising to give him the loyalty and passion I supposedly lacked. Harrison did not pull his hand away immediately. He played his part brilliantly. He offered her sympathetic nods, keeping his face entirely composed, while she poured out every single toxic, manipulative, adulterous word. He gently asked leading questions, prompting her to speak louder and elaborate further on her deep disdain for Jamal and her willingness to abandon her marriage for a wealthier upgrade. Isabella beamed with internal triumph, genuinely believing her feminine charm was successfully reeling him in. She thought she had effectively planted the seed of doubt that would destroy my wedding. What the golden child completely failed to realize was that Harrison's smartphone was sitting face down on the polished bar counter right next to his scotch glass. The screen was dark, but the high-definition voice memo application had been running since the exact second she sat down. He captured her vicious lies, her blatant admission of using Jamal for status, and her explicit attempts to initiate an affair. When Isabella finally finished her martini, she stood up, confident she had won, and blew him a suggestive kiss before walking out of the bar. Harrison watched her leave. He calmly picked up his silver phone, stopped the hidden recording, and deliberately saved the crystal-clear audio file. Without a single ounce of hesitation, he opened his secure email, attached the damning recording, and rapidly forwarded it directly to the ruthless, high-powered divorce attorney Jamal had retained earlier that week. He immediately sent me a very brief text message detailing the entire encounter flawlessly, ensuring that we remained closely united in our shared strategy, while my sister blindly continued to dig her own inescapable grave. Harrison's text message arrived on my secure server just before midnight, verifying that Isabella had enthusiastically taken the bait and sealed her own fate. I sat in my dimly lit penthouse looking out over the sprawling city skyline, feeling a profound sense of closure. Jamal's divorce attorney had confirmed receipt of the audio file by dawn. Isabella was currently waking up in her unpaid luxury suite, blissfully unaware that her husband was drafting an ironclad restraining order and freezing her marital assets based on her recorded infidelity. My father was scrambling to hide his massive financial hemorrhage from his remaining investors. The house of cards my family had meticulously guarded for decades was experiencing a total structural collapse. I poured myself a single cup of black coffee and prepared to leave for my corporate office when my personal cell phone began to vibrate aggressively against the marble kitchen island. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I knew immediately that her sudden desire to communicate was not driven by maternal regret. It was driven by absolute suffocating panic. I tapped the green button and accepted the call, placing the phone on speaker so her voice would echo clearly through the quiet penthouse. Patricia did not bypass pleasantries. She immediately launched into a hysterical, high-pitched screaming fit. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of the refined country club persona she usually weaponized against the world. She wailed that Richard had barely slept in 3 days, that his commercial contractors were walking off the job sites, and that their primary bank had formally issued a notice of intent to seize their suburban estate. But her frantic breakdown quickly pivoted from my father's financial ruin to her golden child's impending social execution. Patricia shrieked that Jamal had just served Isabella with expedited divorce papers via private courier. She screamed that the legal documents specifically cited highly compromising audio evidence of Isabella attempting to solicit a wealthy investor at a hotel bar. Patricia accused me of hiring private detectives to stalk my sister and fabricate digital evidence just to destroy her perfect marriage out of pure spite. She demanded that I immediately transfer the necessary funds to restore Richard's corporate credit lines. She ordered me to personally drive to Jamal's clinic, fall to my knees, and confess that the audio recording was a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence deepfake. When I remained entirely silent, refusing to engage with her delusional demands, Patricia resorted to the only tactic she had left: pure, unadulterated extortion. Her frantic sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by a venomous, calculating snarl. She told me that if I did not wire the money and fix Isabella's marriage, by the end of the business day, she would completely destroy my upcoming wedding. She threatened to hire a team of aggressive tabloid reporters and notorious society bloggers. She swore she would bring them directly to my exclusive rehearsal dinner, which was scheduled to take place the very next evening at my flagship boutique hotel. Patricia promised to stand in front of the flashing cameras and the assembled press, publicly declaring that I was a deranged pathological liar who had abandoned a newborn baby 15 years ago. She threatened to hand out fake medical documents to the journalists, guaranteeing that my professional reputation, my corporate empire, and my marriage to Harrison would be permanently buried under an avalanche of public scandal. She sneered into the receiver, entirely convinced that the threat of a massive society scandal would instantly terrify me into submission, just like it had when I was a helpless teenager. I listened to her unhinged extortion attempt while calmly sipping my black coffee. I did not panic. I did not negotiate. I let out a slow, cold laugh that reverberated clearly through the speakerphone. The sound was so dark and entirely devoid of fear that Patricia actually gasped on the other end of the line. I kept my voice incredibly soft, dropping the pitch, so my words carried the sharp, lethal weight of an absolute promise. I told my mother that her empty threats were absolutely pathetic. I reminded her that she was currently speaking to the woman who owned the banks, breathing down her husband's neck, not the terrified 18-year-old girl she used to verbally abuse behind closed doors. I told her that if she truly believed a few trashy tabloid reporters could intimidate me, she was welcome to try her absolute best. I leaned closer to the phone and delivered my final directive. I told her to bring the reporters. I told her to bring the bloggers, her country club gossips, and every single person she knew to my rehearsal dinner. I informed her that I had already arranged the stage perfectly for her grand performance. Before she could stammer out another desperate threat, I disconnected the call and permanently blocked her number. I immediately dialed Harrison. He answered on the first ring, his steady voice grounding the morning's chaos. I briefed him on Patricia's frantic extortion attempt and her explicit promise to crash our private event with the press. Harrison let out a low chuckle. He noted that my parents were making our job easy by walking right into the kill zone. We agreed to accelerate our final trap. We needed to orchestrate a public execution so flawless that my toxic family would never show their faces in polite society again. Harrison drove directly to my corporate headquarters. We locked ourselves inside my executive boardroom and spread the blueprints of my flagship hotel across the table. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled in the Grand Crystal Ballroom, an opulent space designed for elite galas. We contacted my head of private security and issued a strict mandate. When Richard, Patricia, and Isabella arrived at the front doors tomorrow night, the security team was ordered to be a brief fight before allowing them to breach the perimeter. They were to be granted direct access to the ballroom. We wanted them to feel victorious and arrogant when they stormed into the room. We wanted them to draw maximum attention to themselves. Meanwhile, Harrison contacted the private investigators he kept on retainer. We needed every piece of financial evidence fully weaponized and ready for public display. The trap was set, the bait was taken. Harrison and I spent the rest of the afternoon sequestered in my office, fine-tuning the logistical details of our security perimeter. We were meticulously reviewing the guest list when a sharp knock on the frosted glass doors interrupted our planning. Harrison's lead private investigator, a former forensic accountant named Vance, walked into the room carrying a thick, battered leather briefcase. Vance had been working relentlessly for the past 48 hours, digging deep into the encrypted financial history of my parents. We initially hired his firm to map Richard's failing ventures, but Harrison instructed Vance to look much further back. He wanted to uncover the exact financial footprint my toxic family left behind during the chaotic months surrounding the secret birth 15 years ago. Vance set his briefcase on my desk and pulled out yellowed, digitized bank statements and redacted legal transfers. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me that my parents had hidden a massive illegal financial maneuver right under my nose. He spread the documents across the mahogany table, pointing a pen at a series of wire transfers dated just 3 days after I was forced to sign that fake birth certificate in the rural clinic. I leaned over the table, my eyes scanning the faded ink. I recognized the account number immediately. It was the routing number for a restricted trust fund established by my late grandfather. My grandfather had set up that specific trust entirely for me before he passed away, intending it to be a secure safety net for my college tuition and future business endeavors. It was a fund my parents were legally prohibited from touching without my explicit notarized consent once I turned 18. Vance tapped the paper and explained exactly what they had done. My parents had forged my signature on a massive withdrawal authorization form while I was locked in my bedroom crying over the trauma of the clinic visit. They did not just take a small management fee. They drained exactly $200,000 from my grandfather's trust over the course of 48 hours. They completely emptied the account, leaving me with absolutely nothing but a zero balance. I stared at the numbers on the final printed statement. A cold, heavy sensation settled into my chest as I asked Vance where the stolen money had gone. I knew Richard and Patricia were greedy, but liquidating a trust fund of that size required a specific urgent motivation. Vance pulled out a second set of banking records, these ones acquired through a highly classified financial subpoena. He traced the stolen $200,000 through two separate shell corporations before the money finally landed in a private checking account in a neighboring state. He flipped the page, revealing the name of the account holder. It was the father of Isabella's teenage boyfriend, the very same wealthy politician's son she had been dating when she got pregnant. The puzzle pieces violently slammed into place. Isabella's boyfriend and his politically ambitious family discovered the pregnancy. They knew a scandal of that magnitude would destroy his future political career and their pristine high society standing. They had threatened to expose Isabella to drag her name through the mud and ruin the golden child narrative my parents prized above everything else. My parents needed to buy their absolute silence. They needed hush money to ensure the boyfriend's family would walk away and permanently erase themselves from the narrative. But Richard's business was struggling heavily at the time, completely devoid of the liquid cash required to pay a $200,000 ransom. So they looked at the only accessible pile of cash they could get their hands on: my future. I stood frozen in my office, the reality of their crimes sinking into my bones like ice. They had not just manipulated me into taking the blame for a child that was not mine. They had literally stolen my financial independence to purchase a flawless reputation for Isabella. A flood of bitter memories crashed over me. I remembered graduating high school shortly after the trust fund was drained. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table begging my parents for help with my college tuition. They had looked me right in the eye and coldly stated that I was a disappointment who needed to learn the value of hard work. They told me the trust fund had been lost in a bad market investment. They forced me to work exhausting overnight shifts at a local diner, scrubbing grease off countertops, just to pay for my textbooks. I had spent my early 20s drowning in financial panic, sleeping on a broken mattress in a dangerous neighborhood, fighting for every single inch of my success. While I was burning my hands on hot grills and pulling double shifts, Isabella was living in a luxury condominium, entirely funded by my parents, completely shielded from the consequences of her own reckless actions. They watched me suffer. They had watched me exhausted, hungry, and desperate, knowing perfectly well that they had robbed me blind to protect the sister who sneered at my struggle. Harrison stepped up behind me and gently placed his hands on my shoulders. He read the documents over my head, his jaw clenching with fierce protective anger. He asked me if I was okay. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs. For years, a tiny, foolish part of me had harbored a microscopic shred of empathy for my parents. I had often tried to rationalize their cruelty, telling myself that they were just misguided, status-obsessed people who did not know how to love properly. I had sometimes wondered if going through with this ultimate trap was too harsh. But staring at the irrefutable proof of their financial treason, that final lingering drop of empathy completely evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a dark, absolute resolve. They did not just steal money. They stole the foundation of my youth. They bought Isabella's pristine image with the currency of my suffering. I turned away from the documents and looked at Harrison. My voice was entirely stripped of emotion, hollowed out, and replaced by pure steel. I told him that I was more than okay. I told him that I was perfectly ready to burn their world to the ground. I instructed Vance to package the forged withdrawal slips and the routing numbers into a pristine digital presentation. I wanted the forensic evidence fully weaponized and queued up on the projector screens for the rehearsal dinner. The betrayal was absolute, but the upcoming retaliation would be legendary. My parents had stolen my pass to buy a lie, and tomorrow night I was going to force them to pay the entire bill with heavy interest. The heavy silence in my executive office was abruptly broken by the sharp, sudden ring of the secure intercom on my desk. I pressed the flashing button, expecting an update from my private security team regarding the perimeter protocols for tomorrow night. Instead, my head of security announced that a visitor was waiting in the main lobby, requesting an immediate unrecorded audience with Harrison and me. The visitor was Jamal. I glanced at Harrison, who raised a single eyebrow in quiet surprise. I instructed security to bypass the standard guest logging procedures and escort him directly up to the penthouse suite via the private executive elevator. Less than 3 minutes later, the glass doors to my office slid open. Jamal stepped into the room. The man who stood before us was a stark contrast to the perfectly composed, untouchable orthopedic surgeon I had known for the past 7 years. He was wearing a dark trench coat over his medical scrubs, his broad shoulders tense with an exhaustion that seemed to radiate from his bones. The flawless, confident posture he usually carried had been replaced by a heavy, rigid determination. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces and was now meticulously sweeping up the glass with his bare hands. I gestured toward the leather chairs opposite my desk. Jamal remained standing, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He took a deep breath before speaking. He told me he did not come to negotiate peace for his disgraced wife, but to offer a formal, unconditional apology. Every word carried absolute sincerity. He admitted that throughout his marriage he had allowed himself to be completely blinded by Isabella's high society facade. He confessed to absorbing their fabricated narrative that I was a jealous, erratic woman. He acknowledged treating me with icy distance, judging me based on a fake reality they built to protect their horrific secrets. Jamal offered no excuses. He took full accountability, stating that a man of integrity should have recognized my family's subtle cruelty years ago. He looked me dead in the eye and apologized for failing to see the psychological warfare I endured right in front of him. I sat back, absorbing his words. In my entire life, not a single person associated with my family had ever offered a genuine apology. They only offered manipulation. Jamal was different. How was a good man caught in the crossfire of their sociopathic games? I nodded slowly, accepting his apology with deep respect. Harrison stepped forward, offering Jamal water and gesturing to the chairs. This time, Jamal sat. He unclasped a heavy leather messenger bag on his lap. He told us that after walking out of the steakhouse, he immediately secured his own assets. He had dispatched his personal security to his suburban estate to pack his belongings and lock down his home office before Isabella returned. While clearing a wall safe inside Isabella's private study, his team discovered a hidden compartment. Jamal pulled out a thick red folder bursting with financial ledgers. He placed it squarely on my desk next to Vance's forensic evidence. Jamal explained that Isabella had always handled the back-end bookkeeping for his highly successful private medical practice. He had trusted her completely, believing her Ivy League financial background made her the perfect person to manage his accounts. He was violently wrong. He instructed me to open the red folder. I flipped back the cover, my eyes scanning the highlighted lines of accounting data. Jamal narrated the devastating reality documented on those pages. For the past 4 years, Isabella had been secretly and systematically embezzling massive amounts of cash from his private practice. She had created a sophisticated network of shadow accounts, generated dozens of forged vendor invoices, and manipulated the payroll systems to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars right under his nose. Harrison leaned over my shoulder, analyzing the complex routing numbers. He quickly noticed a glaring pattern. He pointed out that the embezzled funds were not being funneled into offshore accounts for designer clothes, luxury vacations, or hidden real estate. Every single stolen dollar was being wired directly into the primary operating accounts of Richard's failing commercial real estate firm. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Isabella was not just a liar who abandoned her child. She was an active corporate criminal. She had been bleeding her husband's life work dry to artificially prop up our father's bankrupt empire. She was literally buying our parents' continued adoration and funding their elite country club lifestyle with money she stole from the man who loved her. She kept the golden child crown firmly on her head by secretly acting as Richard's illegal bailout fund. Jamal's voice grew dangerously quiet as he confirmed our realization. He stated that Isabella had effectively turned his medical practice into a fraudulent piggy bank for her toxic parents. He had already frozen every single account associated with his clinic and retained a ruthless forensic auditor to document every stolen cent. He was preparing to hand the entire red folder over to the federal authorities, but he chose to bring it to my office first. He looked at Harrison and me, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. Jamal knew exactly what we were planning for the rehearsal dinner. He knew we were setting a massive, inescapable trap for the family that had destroyed his life and stolen my youth. He slid the red folder closer to me, officially adding his lethal ammunition to our arsenal. He stated that he wanted me to have the financial evidence to use exactly as I saw fit when the final curtain fell. He then made a single request. He asked for a front row seat to their absolute destruction tomorrow night. I placed my hand firmly over the thick folder, meeting his intense gaze. I guaranteed him the best seat in the house for their ultimate downfall. After Jamal left my office, Harrison and I locked the thick red folder in my secure wall safe alongside Vance's forensic financial evidence. We had successfully amassed enough legal and financial ammunition to utterly obliterate my parents and my sister. But there was still one final crucial piece of the puzzle that required our immediate attention. We needed to check on the epicenter of this entire storm. We left the corporate headquarters, stepped into Harrison's sleek black car, and quickly drove out of the bustling downtown district, leaving the towering skyscrapers behind as we navigated toward the quiet, serene, tree-lined suburbs. The drive was peaceful, a stark contrast to the vicious corporate warfare we had been waging all morning. I watched the luxury high-rises fade into cozy, manicured neighborhoods, feeling a profound sense of anticipation. We were heading to the home of Monica Harrison's older sister, the woman who had stepped in 15 years ago and saved a discarded infant from becoming a tragic statistic in the state foster system. Monica lived in a beautiful, sprawling colonial house, wrapped in climbing ivy, radiating the exact kind of warmth and safety my own childhood home had entirely lacked. Harrison parked the car in the wide driveway. Before we even reached the front porch, the solid oak door swung open. Monica stepped out to greet us. She was a fierce, fiercely protective woman with Harrison's same sharp, analytical eyes, but an incredibly warm smile. She pulled me into a deep, grounding embrace, offering a silent acknowledgement of the brutal chaos she knew my family was currently unleashing. Monica ushered us inside the bright, beautifully decorated, sunlit foyer. The house was filled with the comforting sounds of normal, healthy family life. It was a haven built on genuine love, completely devoid of the toxic, status-obsessed, performative garbage that defined my upbringing. We walked into the spacious, open-concept kitchen, and that was when I saw her. Lily was sitting at the massive marble island, casually flipping through a thick, advanced placement chemistry textbook while snacking on a bowl of sliced apples. She looked up as we entered. The physical resemblance to Isabella was absolutely staggering, a ghost from 15 years ago sitting right in front of me, but the energy she projected was entirely different. Lily did not have Isabella's sneering arrogance or the desperate manipulative hunger for attention that plagued my sister. Instead, Lily possessed a quiet, razor-sharp intelligence and a grounded confidence that immediately commanded respect. She closed her textbook and stood up, wiping her hands on a napkin. She did not look at me with pity or confusion. Monica and Harrison had always believed in absolute transparency. They raised Lily with the complete, unfiltered truth about her origins. They never hid the fact that she was adopted, and when she was old enough to comprehend the complexity of the situation, they explained exactly how that adoption came to be. Lily knew that her biological mother was a cowardly, image-obsessed college student who desperately wanted her permanently erased to maintain her flawless social standing. She also knew that the frightened 18-year-old girl who signed the birth certificate was the only reason she ended up in Monica's loving arms. Lily walked around the kitchen island and stopped right in front of me. For a moment, the air in the room stood completely still. Then she reached out and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, incredibly mature hug. When she pulled back, her eyes were clear and completely void of anger. She looked at me and spoke with a level of articulation and emotional maturity that far exceeded her 15 years. She told me that she harbored absolutely zero resentment toward me for the events of the past. She said she fully understood that my parents had cornered me in that grimy rural clinic and violently forced me to take the catastrophic fall to protect their precious golden child from facing any real consequences. Lily stated that she did not view me as a liar or a coward. She viewed me as her ultimate protector. She thanked me for ensuring she was handed over to a reputable agency, rather than being dumped into the chaotic, overcrowded foster care system my parents had initially threatened to use. She expressed profound gratitude that my traumatic sacrifice directly resulted in her being raised by Monica, surrounded by unconditional love and unwavering support. Hearing those words from the very child my family had discarded felt like a massive heavy chain snapping right off my chest. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not from sorrow but from absolute overwhelming relief. I thanked her for her grace and remarkable understanding. Harrison stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder, and asked how she was handling the recent explosive fallout from the steakhouse encounter. That was when Lily's expression shifted drastically. The warm gratitude vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, steely resolve that perfectly mirrored Harrison's ruthless business demeanor. She looked at her adoptive mother, then at Harrison, and finally locked her intense, calculating gaze directly onto me. Lily announced that she had a strict, non-negotiable demand regarding our upcoming counterattack. She knew exactly what Patricia had threatened over the phone that morning. She knew my biological family was actively planning to crash the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night, with tabloid reporters to destroy my professional reputation and force me into complete submission. Lily stated with absolute unflinching conviction that she was not going to sit safely hidden away in the quiet suburbs, while the cowardly woman who threw her away tried to ruin the incredibly brave woman who saved her. She demanded to be at that dinner alongside us. She vehemently insisted on walking directly into that grand, crowded ballroom and looking her biological mother dead in the eye to personally deliver the ultimate undeniable reckoning that Isabella had spent her entire life trying to avoid. Monica agreed without hesitation, recognizing the fierce determination burning in her daughter's eyes. We finalized the logistics and drove back to the city, the heavy anticipation of the coming evening settling over us. The sun rose the next morning, casting a brilliant golden light across the downtown skyline. It was officially the day of our rehearsal dinner. I stood in the center of the Grand Crystal Ballroom, the crown jewel of my flagship boutique hotel. The space was an architectural masterpiece I had designed myself, featuring soaring vaulted ceilings, cascading crystal chandeliers, and polished marble floors. It was built to host elite corporate galas and high society weddings. Tonight it would serve as the ultimate execution chamber for my family's fabricated legacy. Because I owned the building, I controlled every single variable within its walls. The staff answered exclusively to me, the layout was customized to my exact specifications, and the environment was entirely secured under my direct command. I walked across the massive room, ensuring the tables were arranged flawlessly for the hundreds of wealthy investors, industry colleagues, and elite socialites who would soon fill the room. My mother had promised to bring a horde of hungry tabloid reporters and gossip bloggers to destroy my reputation. I wanted to make absolutely certain that her hand-picked audience had an unobstructed view of the stage. At noon, I called my head of private security into the ballroom for a final crucial briefing. He arrived with a team of elite, highly trained personnel who usually handled protection details for visiting dignitaries and celebrities. I handed him a printed list containing the names and photographs of Richard, Patricia, and Isabella. I gave him a very specific, unconventional set of operational orders. I told him that my parents and my sister would attempt to crash the private event later that evening. I explicitly instructed him not to turn them away or call the police when they showed up at the front doors. Instead, his team was ordered to put up a brief theatrical struggle. They were to demand invitations and block the entrance just long enough to make my family feel enraged and highly motivated. Then, at the precise moment my father started shouting and trying to force his way inside, the guards were instructed to suddenly back down and grant them direct, unfettered access to the ballroom. My family needed to feel an overwhelming surge of arrogant victory. They needed to genuinely believe they had successfully breached my defenses and overpowered my security perimeter. If they felt triumphant, they would march into the center of the room with their chests puffed out, drawing maximum attention to themselves. I wanted them loud, confident, and completely oblivious to the fact that they were walking straight into a perfectly engineered slaughterhouse. While I finalized the security protocols at the main entrance, Harrison was busy orchestrating the digital trap at the back of the room. He stood at the master control console working directly with my hotel's elite audiovisual tech team. The Grand Crystal Ballroom was equipped with state-of-the-art presentation technology, including 4 massive high-definition projector screens that dropped seamlessly from the ceiling on all 4 sides of the room. Harrison systematically linked his personal smartphone to the central broadcasting mainframe. He ran several rigorous diagnostic tests, ensuring that he could control every single screen and speaker in the ballroom with a simple tap on his screen. He meticulously loaded the digital arsenal we had gathered over the past 48 hours into a secure encrypted presentation folder. First, he uploaded the high-resolution scans of the certified DNA test. Next came the damning financial documents Vance had unearthed, clearly displaying the forged signatures and the illegal wire transfers draining my grandfather's trust fund. Then he added the meticulous spreadsheets from Jamal's red folder, highlighting every single dollar Isabella had embezzled from his private medical practice to bail out Richard's failing real estate firm. Finally, Harrison uploaded the crystal-clear audio recording of Isabella attempting to seduce him at the hotel bar. He tested the audio playback, adjusting the acoustic equalization so that my sister's toxic manipulative voice would echo loudly and perfectly across the entire expanse of the ballroom, making it absolutely impossible for anyone to ignore. By 5 o'clock in this evening, the elaborate trap was fully primed, loaded, and waiting for the designated targets to arrive. The caterers finished setting up the gourmet stations. The string quartet began tuning their instruments in the corner, and the lighting was dimmed to a sophisticated dramatic glow. I retreated to my private executive suite upstairs to change into my evening attire. I chose a striking black gown that projected absolute power and unbothered confidence. I fastened a simple diamond necklace around my throat, looked at my reflection in the mirror, and felt a profound sense of icy calm wash over my entire body. There was no anxiety left in my veins. The terrified, obedient scapegoat daughter was completely gone, permanently replaced by a woman who commanded her own destiny. I walked downstairs and met Harrison at the entrance of the ballroom. He looked incredibly sharp in his tailored dark suit, his eyes shining with fierce, protective anticipation. Jamal had already arrived through a private side entrance and taken his seat at a VIP table near the front of the stage, his posture rigid and ready. Monica and Lily were stationed safely in a secluded green room just behind the main presentation stage, waiting for my specific signal. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and our high society guests began to flood into the opulent space. The clinking of champagne glasses and the low murmur of wealthy elite conversations filled the air. I took a deep breath, intertwined my fingers with Harrison's, and stepped forward to greet our guests. We smiled, we mingled, and we waited for the inevitable arrival of the traitors, who thought they were coming to destroy me. The Grand Crystal Ballroom hummed with the incredibly sophisticated energy of the city's most influential power brokers. Harrison and I circulated among the elite crowd, shaking hands with hedge fund managers, real estate magnates, and investors, holding sway over the regional economy. Waiters glided across polished marble floors, balancing silver trays loaded with champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. The string quartet played a lively classical piece setting a tone of absolute luxury. This was not merely a rehearsal dinner. It was a massive display of corporate dominance carefully curated to showcase the impenetrable alliance Harrison and I had built. I stood near the center of the room exchanging pleasantries with a state senator when a sudden commotion erupted at the main entrance. The heavy oak doors were violently shoved open, slamming against the brass stops with a resonant crack that instantly severed the polite chatter. The string quartet abruptly ceased playing, leaving a hollow, echoing silence in their wake. Right on cue, exactly as my private security team had been instructed, the guards stepped back, parting to allow the intruders direct access to the ballroom. Richard, Patricia, and Isabella marched through the grand entryway, their chests puffed out with the arrogant, delusional belief that they successfully overpowered my elite security perimeter. They walked with the aggressive swagger of people who thought they were holding all the winning cards. Patricia had dressed herself for maximum theatrical impact. She wore a sweeping, dramatically dark gown looking more appropriate for a high society funeral than a rehearsal dinner accessorized with a thick veil of black lace and a massive string of heavy pearls she could clutch whenever she needed to feign a heart palpitation. Her face was contoured to look deliberately haggard and grief-stricken. A masterclass in manipulative aesthetics designed specifically to elicit immediate sympathy from the onlookers. Richard flanked her on the right side, his face fixed into a stern, righteous scowl. He adjusted his silk tie and glared at the room, projecting the false authority of a devastated patriarch, trying to save an innocent man from ruin. But it was Isabella who commanded the most attention. The golden child stormed ahead of her parents, her eyes blazing with unhinged, venomous determination. She wore an immaculate, blindingly white designer dress, a desperate visual attempt to project absolute purity and victimhood. She ignored the hundreds of shocked faces staring at her and marched directly toward the dead center of the ballroom, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The entire room of investors, politicians, and high society friends fell completely silent, their champagne glasses suspended in midair, utterly captivated by the bizarre, chaotic spectacle unfolding right in front of them. Isabella stopped in the very middle of the dance floor, took a deep breath, and raised her voice to a piercing, hysterical volume that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. She pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face and shrieked that the entire wedding needed to be canceled immediately. She spun around, addressing the horrified crowd of elite guests, loudly declaring that they were all celebrating a dangerous, calculated monster. She shouted that I was a pathological liar who spent my entire life deceiving everyone in this room, hiding a dark, sickening past that would make their blood run cold. She locked eyes with Harrison, projecting a look of manufactured pity, wailing that I was currently holding her elderly parents hostage with malicious corporate extortion just to cover up my unforgivable sins. Patricia immediately caught her specific cue and launched into her weeping routine. She collapsed slightly against Richard, burying her face in her hands and letting out loud, echoing sobs bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. She cried out to the crowd that she failed as a mother, that she tried so hard to love me, but my soul was simply too broken and selfish to be saved. She gasped for air, clutching her pearls, and wailed that I ruthlessly abandoned a helpless newborn baby 15 years ago, dumping the infant like unwanted garbage to protect my own selfish ambitions. She screamed that I stole money from my family and was now trying to destroy my perfect sister out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. The crowd gasped in unison. The elite socialites whispered frantically behind their hands, their eyes darting between my weeping mother, my screaming sister, and me. Isabella paced across the center of the room, fueling the fire her mother just started. She yelled to the investors that my entire hotel empire was built on a foundation of sociopathic lies and stolen funds. She warned Harrison's colleagues that I would eventually drain their accounts and discard them, just like I discarded my own flesh and blood. She turned back to Harrison, her voice cracking with fake, desperate emotion, begging him to walk away from the altar before I trapped him in a marriage built on deep, horrifying abuse. She claimed she was only there because she cared too much about his safety to let him marry a monster. Throughout this unhinged performance, I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still next to Harrison, my face an impenetrable mask of icy calm. I did not try to interrupt Isabella's screaming, nor defend myself against Patricia's wailing accusations. I simply let them put on the exact show I wanted. I let them dig their graves in front of the city's most powerful people, ensuring their vicious lies were broadcast loudly to the exact audience they desperately needed to impress. I glanced at Jamal sitting at a VIP table near the front, watching his wife self-destruct with a look of absolute unwavering disgust. Harrison reached out and gently took my hand, his grip solid and reassuring. The trap had been flawlessly executed. My toxic family confidently marched into the center of the kill zone, unaware that the digital guillotine was hanging directly above their heads, primed and ready to drop. Isabella refused to let the silence settle. She paced across the polished marble floor, whipping her head back and forth to ensure she captured every single gaze in the grand ballroom. She raised her hands to her face, forcing a fresh cascade of tears to spill over her cheeks, delivering a performance that belonged on a theatrical stage rather than a corporate gathering. She wailed that I was a textbook sociopath. She loudly proclaimed to the elite crowd that my entire life was a carefully constructed facade designed to hide my total lack of basic human empathy. According to her wildly fabricated narrative, I was the one who had gotten pregnant at 18, callously dumped my newborn infant at a filthy rural clinic, and walked away without shedding a single tear. She screamed that I had stolen money from our elderly parents to fund my initial business ventures, bleeding our family dry while they tried to cover up my shameful, heartless mistakes. Isabella pointed her manicured finger at me again, her voice shaking with manufactured grief. She told Harrison's investors that I was currently engaged in a massive illegal extortion campaign. She claimed that I was leveraging my newly acquired corporate wealth to blackmail my own father, threatening to destroy his real estate firm unless he bowed to my jealous, vindictive demands. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, the perfect, loving sister who had spent years trying to save me from my own darkness, only to be targeted and destroyed by my relentless envy. She cried that I was desperately trying to ruin her marriage to Jamal out of pure spite because I could never achieve the genuine love and respect she possessed so naturally. Patricia immediately amplified the spectacle. She threw herself against Richard's shoulder, letting out loud, echoing sobs that demanded absolute attention from the high society guests. She wailed in agreement with every single lie Isabella spat out. She cried to the crowd that they had tried everything to fix me, sending me to therapists, and offering me endless support, but I was simply born with a cold, defective heart. She begged the room to understand their pain, portraying herself as a tragically broken mother who had to watch her oldest perfect daughter be viciously attacked by her youngest sociopathic child. Richard wrapped his arm around Patricia, adopting the role of the stoic, devastated patriarch, protecting his family from a monster. The guests in the grand ballroom were completely captivated by the horrifying spectacle. Elite socialites covered their mouths in shock. Wealthy investors exchanged nervous, bewildered glances, clearly wondering if the woman they were doing business with was actually a dangerous criminal. The room was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of Isabella's meticulously crafted lies. Isabella stood in the center of it all, her chest heaving as she let out a final dramatic sob. She looked at me, a brief triumphant gleam flashing in her eyes. She genuinely believed she had just delivered the fatal blow. She thought she had successfully turned the most powerful people in the city against me, guaranteeing my total social and financial ruin. I remained perfectly still. I did not break eye contact with her, nor did I show a single ounce of panic. I simply stood there in my black gown, projecting an impenetrable aura of absolute dominance. I let the silence stretch, allowing Isabella's toxic echoes to fully saturate the room. I wanted every single guest to remember exactly what she had said. I wanted them to internalize her vicious lies so that the incoming truth would strike with maximum devastating force. Harrison released my hand. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket with a smooth, effortless motion that radiated calm authority. He did not look angry. He did not look defensive. He looked like a predator observing prey that had just confidently walked into a steel trap. He slowly walked forward, closing the distance between us and the center of the ballroom. His footsteps were deliberate, commanding the immediate attention of the entire room. He bypassed Isabella completely, treating her as if she were entirely invisible. He walked straight to the podium set up for the evening's toasts and smoothly unclipped the wireless microphone from its stand. The high-pitched feedback from the speakers caused a few guests to flinch, but Harrison remained perfectly composed. He held the microphone, his posture relaxed but commanding. Isabella stared at him, her fake tears drying up as confusion began to fracture her confident facade. She expected him to yell. She expected him to demand answers, to express horror, or to angrily defend my honor. She desperately wanted a chaotic emotional reaction to validate her theatrical performance. Harrison gave her absolutely nothing. He stood at the podium and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors' colleagues and high society friends. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that cut through the tension like a blade. His tone was perfectly even, devoid of any panic or hesitation. He turned his head and locked his gaze directly onto Isabella. He let a cold, sharp smile touch the corners of his mouth. He leaned into the microphone, ensuring his voice would echo across every inch of the grand ballroom. He told Isabella that her concern for the abandoned child was truly touching. He praised her remarkable performance, noting the sheer emotional effort it must have taken to stand in front of such a prestigious crowd and weep for a baby discarded 15 years ago. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the crowd to absorb his calm demeanor. Harrison delivered the pivot. He tightened his grip on the microphone and delivered a single sentence that instantly changed the atmospheric pressure in the room. He said, "If you are so deeply concerned about the child who was abandoned, Isabella, let us hear from her." The heavy double doors at the far end of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. The sudden movement drew the gaze of every single guest away from Harrison and toward the back of the cavernous space. For a fraction of a second, the room held its collective breath. Then Monica stepped through the threshold. She walked with the fierce, unyielding posture of a woman who had spent 15 years fiercely protecting a child from the very monsters currently standing in the center of the room. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of grounded reality that violently clashed with the superficial glitter of my family. Right behind Monica, stepping into the brilliant glow of the crystal chandeliers, was Lily. The physical impact of Lily stepping into the light was immediate and absolute. As the 15-year-old girl moved forward, the whispers among the high society guests abruptly ceased. The resemblance was not just striking, it was entirely undeniable. Lily possessed the exact same bone structure, the identical shape of the eyes, and the precise dark hair that Isabella had flaunted her entire life. It was as if someone had pulled a photograph of Isabella from 15 years ago and manifested it right into the middle of the rehearsal dinner. The genetic truth was walking right down the center aisle, breathing, observing, and completely shattering the fabricated reality my parents had paid so dearly to protect. The crowd of wealthy investors and elite socialites instinctively parted like the Red Sea. They stepped back, clearing a wide, unobstructed path for Monica and Lily. You could practically hear the gears turning in the minds of the hundreds of guests as they looked from the teenager walking down the aisle to the woman standing frozen in the white designer dress. The whispered realizations began to ripple through the ballroom. The math was incredibly simple, and the visual evidence was absolute. Patricia actually dropped her heavy string of pearls. The expensive jewelry clattered against her chest as her hands fell limply to her sides. All the manufactured grief and theatrical sobbing vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a hollow, sickening dread. She stared at the granddaughter she had ruthlessly discarded, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Beside her, Richard looked as though he had just been struck by a physical blow. The arrogant patriarch who had confidently marched into my hotel to destroy my life was now trembling, his face drained of every drop of blood. He recognized the ghost of the secret he had stolen my trust fund to bury. But Isabella's reaction was the most devastating to witness. The golden child was entirely paralyzed. Her eyes were blown wide, locked onto the approaching teenager, in a state of absolute, unadulterated terror. She looked at Lily and saw the very consequence she had spent a decade and a half desperately trying to erase. Isabella's pristine white dress suddenly looked like a mockery. Her meticulously crafted victim narrative was evaporating into thin air. She tried to take a step backward, but her legs refused to move. She tried to speak, to spin another lie, to scream that it was a trick, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She was trapped in the center of the room, pinned down by the unrelenting gaze of the daughter she had thrown away. Lily did not look intimidated by the opulent surroundings or the hundreds of wealthy strangers staring at her. She walked with a calm, razor-sharp focus that perfectly mirrored Harrison's lethal composure. She reached the front of this ballroom, stopping just a few feet away from where my family stood frozen in their tracks. Monica remained standing firmly right behind her, an unbreakable shield of maternal protection. Harrison stepped aside with a respectful nod. He held out the wireless microphone. Lily took it. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not fidget. She did not look away. She turned her head and locked her intense, calculating eyes directly onto Isabella's panicked, bloodless face. The grand ballroom was so incredibly quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Every single person in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the devastating impact. Lily raised the microphone. She spoke with brutal, uncompromising clarity. Her voice did not shake. It rang out across the vast space, cutting through the heavy tension with absolute precision. She said, "Hi, biological mother. Thanks for tossing me away like garbage so Aunt Olivia could ensure I was adopted by people who actually have souls." The collective gasp from the high society crowd was deafening. It was a massive synchronized shockwave that completely altered the atmospheric pressure in the room. Wealthy socialites visibly recoiled, their hands flying to their mouths in absolute horror. Corporate investors who had just listened to Isabella's weeping accusations now stared at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. The harsh, condemning murmurs erupted instantly. The guests were not confused. Lily's statement, combined with the undeniable physical resemblance, completely obliterated the lie. Isabella was not the grieving sister trying to save a man from a monster. Isabella was the monster. She was a woman who had abandoned her own infant and then tried to publicly frame her innocent sister for the crime. Isabella turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The last remaining fragments of her golden child facade shattered into dust. She was completely exposed in front of the most powerful people in the city. Her reputation, her social standing, and her entire fabricated identity were annihilated in a single perfectly delivered sentence. She stood there completely paralyzed, suffocating in the absolute wreckage of her own malicious design. She was drowning in a public execution of her own making. The trap had closed perfectly around her neck, and the real destruction had only just begun. Every single lie she had ever told was now laid bare for the entire world to judge. Every single lie she had ever told was now laid bare for the entire world to judge. Harrison stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, silently thanking her for her immense courage. He took the wireless microphone back from her steady grip. He did not say a word to the stunned audience. Instead, he simply raised his left hand and pressed a single button on a small, sleek remote control he had been keeping hidden in his palm. Instantly, the ambient lighting in the grand ballroom dimmed to a cinematic darkness. A mechanical hum vibrated through the high ceilings as four massive high-definition projector screens silently descended along the walls of the room. The transition was incredibly smooth, a flawless execution by my hotel's elite audiovisual team. The attention of every single guest shifted from the devastating scene on the floor to the glowing white screens surrounding them. Harrison pressed a second button. A crisp, digitally enhanced audio file began to play, blasting through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. The acoustics in the ballroom were absolute perfection. There was no static, no distortion, just the unmistakable, crystal-clear sound of a busy upscale hotel bar. The clinking of crystal glasses and the faint murmur of background jazz filled the room. Then a voice cut through the speakers. It was a voice everyone in the room instantly recognized. It was Isabella. The recording captured her exactly as she had sounded just 48 hours ago, leaning over the mahogany bar, desperate and heavily intoxicated. Her recorded words washed over the dead silent ballroom, dripping with manufactured vulnerability and undeniable malice. "Harrison, please, you have to listen to me." Isabella's recorded voice pleaded, the heavy slurring of a dirty martini clinging to her words. "You have no idea what my sister is actually like. She is clinically insane. She is a completely broken, defective person who just wants to steal your money." The guests in the ballroom exchanged horrified glances. On the dance floor, Isabella clamped her hands over her ears as if she could physically block the sound of her own voice from ruining her life. But the speakers were merciless. The recording continued broadcasting her vicious attempt to sabotage my marriage to the exact people she had just tried to convince of her own victimhood. "You deserve a real woman," the recorded Isabella purred, her tone dropping into a sickening, calculated seduction. "Someone from a proper pedigree. Someone who knows how to treat a man of your caliber." Then came the fatal blow. On the recording, Harrison's calm voice could be heard asking a simple leading question. "What about your husband? What about Jamal?" The response that echoed across the ballroom was so incredibly vile that several guests physically recoiled. Isabella let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Jamal is nothing," she scoffed on the tape. "He is a terribly boring paycheck, a stepping stone to keep my parents happy. I am suffocating in that marriage, Harrison. He has zero ambition outside of his little medical clinic. I need someone with real power. I could give you everything Olivia cannot. Just say the word and I will leave him tonight." The audio file ended with the distinct sound of Isabella blowing a suggestive kiss. The screens went entirely black. The grand ballroom was plunged into an absolute ringing silence. The elite crowd was utterly horrified. These were prominent investors, hospital board members, and high society matriarchs who had dined with Isabella, attended her charity galas, and believed her to be the epitome of grace and marital devotion. Now they looked at her as if she were a toxic, contagious disease. The revulsion on their faces was raw and unfiltered. They had just listened to a woman explicitly offer to abandon her respected husband for a wealthier upgrade, all while actively trying to seduce her sister's fiancé. It was the ultimate display of narcissistic depravity. The facade they had spent decades meticulously building was completely atomized in exactly 3 minutes. Patricia, who had spent her entire life curating the illusion of high society perfection, let out a choked, desperate whimper. She frantically raised her hands to cover her face, unable to bear the searing, judgmental stares of the very women she had tried to impress for 30 years. She shrank into herself, her dramatic black gown suddenly looking like a physical manifestation of her complete social death. There was no more fake crying, there were no more theatrical pearls to clutch. She was utterly destroyed. Richard was equally decimated. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had marched into my hotel acting like a conqueror was now acting like a trapped rat. His chest heaved as panic flooded his veins. He looked frantically around the expansive ballroom, his eyes darting wildly in search of an exit. He spun around intending to flee the suffocating humiliation, but he immediately froze. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance were completely blocked. My elite private security team stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed, forming an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. They were not there to keep people out anymore. They were there to ensure my family stayed right in the center of the kill zone until the absolute end of the execution. Isabella could not run. She could not hide. She was entirely surrounded by hundreds of disgusted faces. Her pristine white designer dress offered zero protection against the overwhelming wave of public condemnation crashing down upon her. She looked at the VIP table where her husband was sitting. Jamal did not look surprised by the audio recording. He looked thoroughly, coldly vindicated. Isabella's knees finally buckled under the immense weight of her total humiliation. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, her perfect posture crumbling as she realized she had just broadcast her own infidelity and malicious greed to every single person who mattered in her world. The golden child was entirely dethroned, stripped of her wealth, her marriage, and her dignity in front of a live audience. Jamal pushed his chair back from the VIP table near the front of the stage. The scrape of the wooden legs against the marble floor echoed through the dead, silent ballroom. He stood up to his full height. As a highly respected surgeon, he carried himself with an imposing, dignified authority that commanded instant respect. He smoothed the lapels of his dark suit and walked deliberately toward the center of the room, right to where his wife was still crumpled on the floor. Isabella looked up at him through her ruined makeup. She reached a shaking hand toward his shoe, opening her mouth to beg to offer another pathetic excuse or to try and manipulate him one last time. Jamal did not let her speak. He raised his hand, silencing her instantly. From under his arm, he produced the thick red folder he had brought to my office earlier that morning. He did not hand it to her. He raised it high and threw it directly at her feet. The heavy folder slammed against the polished stone, bursting open. Dozens of bank statements, forged vendor invoices, and highlighted accounting ledgers spilled out, scattering across the floor surrounding her pristine white dress. Isabella stared at the financial documents, her eyes wide with fresh, absolute terror. Jamal looked down at her with a gaze so incredibly cold it could freeze water. He projected his voice so every wealthy investor and high society guest in the room could hear his absolute judgment. He announced that he had just handed her the comprehensive audit of his private medical practice. He stated clearly and methodically that he now possessed irrefutable proof she had been secretly embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his clinic's operating accounts. He explained to the horrified crowd that his wife had been committing systemic corporate fraud to quietly bail out her father's sinking commercial real estate firm. The gasps from the audience grew louder as the magnitude of her financial crimes became public knowledge. Jamal declared that the folder contained the exact legal filings his attorneys had submitted to the courts that very afternoon. He announced that he had officially filed for an expedited divorce and permanently frozen all their marital assets. Furthermore, he stated that he had handed the complete forensic audit directly to federal prosecutors to press criminal charges for grand larceny and embezzlement. He turned on his heel, walked back to his VIP table, and sat down. Isabella let out a suffocated gasp, clutching the scattered bank statements against her chest as the reality of her impending prison sentence crashed over her. But the execution was not over yet. I stepped forward, stepping right over the spilled financial documents, and raised the wireless microphone to my lips. I bypassed my broken sister entirely and locked my gaze directly onto my parents. Richard and Patricia were huddled together, physically trembling. I addressed them with a voice forged from pure, unyielding steel. I announced to the captivated room that my parents were not just abusive manipulators who forced a teenager to take the fall for a massive family scandal. They were heartless thieves who had actively financed their perfect golden child illusion with stolen money. I looked right into my father's panicked eyes and publicly detailed exactly what he had done 15 years ago. I explained to the wealthy investors standing around us that my late grandfather had established a highly secure restricted trust fund intended solely for my college tuition and future business endeavors. I revealed that just 3 days after my parents physically forced me to sign that fake birth certificate in a grimy rural clinic, they forged my signature on a massive withdrawal authorization form. I stated clearly that Richard and Patricia illegally drained $200,000 from my grandfather's trust. They completely emptied my account and wired every single stolen dollar to the family of Isabella's teenage boyfriend. They used my financial future to buy the absolute silence of a wealthy politician's son, purchasing Isabella's flawless reputation with the exact currency of my suffering. I did not stop there. I told Richard that he was a fool for thinking he could march into my corporate headquarters and threaten my zoning permits when his own financial foundation was built entirely on federal crimes. I announced that Harrison's private investigators and my elite team of forensic accountants had spent the last 48 hours meticulously tracing the dirty money. I informed my parents that we had successfully acquired the forged withdrawal slips, the redacted legal transfers, and the exact routing numbers linking them to the illegal payout. I revealed that my corporate attorneys had already submitted the entire mountain of irrefutable evidence directly to federal authorities. Warrants were being drafted. Investigations were already open. They were going to lose their absolute freedom. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic cry. He lunged forward, raising his hands as if he was going to try and silence me by force. I did not flinch. I simply lowered the microphone and raised my left hand, giving a sharp, definitive signal to my head of private security. The elite guards standing at the perimeter immediately sprang into action. They descended upon the center of the ballroom with brutal, synchronized efficiency. Two massive guards grabbed Richard by the arms, completely ignoring his frantic, arrogant demands to be released. Another guard hoisted Patricia to her feet as she wailed uncontrollably. Two more guards forcefully hauled Isabella off the polished marble floor, ignoring her hysterical screams. The entire high society crowd parted widely, stepping back in pure disgust as my toxic, disgraced family was aggressively dragged across the grand ballroom. They kicked and shrieked empty threats, but my security team marched them relentlessly toward the heavy oak doors. I stood alongside Jamal, Monica, and Lily, watching with absolute profound satisfaction as they were forcefully ejected from my magnificent hotel, banished into the cold night to await their inevitable devastating arrests and public ruin. The heavy, solid oak doors of the grand ballroom slammed tightly shut, sealing my toxic family out in the freezing cold night and officially initiating their absolute destruction. The weekend passed in a state of profound, unprecedented peace. Harrison and I spent Sunday finalizing our wedding details entirely undisturbed by hysterical phone calls or desperate extortion attempts. My family's silence was not born out of newfound respect for my boundaries. It was the terrified, paralyzing silence of criminals waiting for the impending strike. That strike landed with devastating, unyielding force at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. Richard arrived at his downtown commercial real estate headquarters, desperately hoping to orchestrate a frantic cover-up before the financial sector opened. He was far too late. A coordinated task force of federal agents, local police, and heavily armed IRS investigators had already surrounded the building. The authorities possessed the comprehensive forensic audit Jamal had submitted alongside the extensive trust fund fraud documentation my corporate lawyers had legally handed over. They did not knock politely. They breached the executive suites, displaying sweeping federal warrants authorizing the immediate seizure of all corporate assets, financial ledgers, and digital servers. Richard watched in sheer, suffocating horror as federal agents boxed up his computers and hauled his chief financial officer out in handcuffs. The media arrived within 20 minutes. News vans swarmed the plaza, broadcasting live footage of the raid across every major local channel. My father, the arrogant patriarch who had built his entire identity on dominating others, was filmed being aggressively escorted to a federal vehicle for extensive questioning regarding grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud. His business empire was dismantled and seized before he could even finish his morning coffee. While Richard was sitting in a sterile interrogation room, desperately begging for legal counsel, Patricia was experiencing her own spectacular execution in the affluent suburbs. She had foolishly believed she could salvage her reputation by playing the victim one last time. She dressed in her finest tennis attire and drove her luxury SUV to the elite country club where she had reigned as the undisputed social queen for over 2 decades. She expected to sit on the terrace, sip mimosas, and spin a tragic narrative about her ungrateful, psychotic daughter. She barely made it past the wrought iron front gates. The club's general manager intercepted her right in the manicured driveway. He was flanked by 2 stern security guards. He did not offer her a polite greeting. He handed her a crisp, formally typed letter from the board of directors. The letter stated that her membership had been revoked with immediate effect due to conduct severely detrimental to the reputation of the establishment. The manager bluntly informed her that she was permanently banned from the premises and threatened her with a trespassing charge if she refused to leave. Patricia's social obliteration rapidly accelerated throughout the afternoon. Every single prestigious charity board she served on convened emergency meetings. They ruthlessly scrubbed her name from their websites, canceled her upcoming galas, and issued cold public statements, actively distancing their organizations from her ongoing federal fraud scandal. The wealthy socialites she had spent 30 years desperately trying to impress universally blocked her phone number. She was entirely excommunicated from high society, stripped of her status, and left completely isolated in a world that now viewed her as toxic radioactive waste. The swift legal and social avalanches raining down on my parents were merely the prelude to the ultimate financial reckoning they were about to face. Richard's once highly profitable real estate firm was already bleeding millions of dollars every single month, artificially propped up solely by the stolen cash Isabella had illegally funneled from Jamal's private medical practice. With Isabella's illicit pipeline permanently severed by the highly publicized divorce proceedings and the aggressive federal raid, freezing his remaining operating accounts, Richard was rendered completely financially paralyzed. On Wednesday morning, my corporate legal team officially delivered the final fatal blow to his dying empire. Acting strictly as the majority shareholder of the private LLC that secretly owned his commercial debt, I explicitly instructed my attorneys to execute the acceleration clause on all of his outstanding business loans. I aggressively called in every single cent of his massive debt, demanding immediate full financial repayment within 24 hours. Richard had absolutely zero financial liquidity remaining. He could not leverage his physical assets because the federal government had already placed heavy, unyielding liens on his properties, pending the final outcome of the ongoing embezzlement investigation. The arrogant patriarch was trapped in a financial corner entirely of his own making. By Thursday afternoon, Richard had no other viable legal option to avoid going to federal prison for debt evasion. He walked into a drab municipal courthouse, a broken, defeated shell of a man, and officially filed for absolute Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The immediate consequences were utterly devastating for a man driven solely by extreme materialism. The municipal bankruptcy courts appointed a highly ruthless liquidator to aggressively dismantle his remaining wealth to pay off his staggering corporate liabilities. The liquidator immediately targeted his most prized possession. The sprawling multi-million-dollar suburban estate where I had grown up enduring their psychological abuse was formally seized by the bank. Foreclosure notices were aggressively nailed to the custom oak front doors. Richard and Patricia were given exactly 7 days to vacate the luxurious premises. They were forcefully ordered to pack whatever meager personal belongings the ruthless federal agents had not already strictly confiscated as legal evidence. They watched their designer furniture, imported luxury vehicles, and expensive art collections get aggressively auctioned off to satisfy their massive mountain of toxic debt. The grand, perfect family illusion they had sacrificed my entire youth to protect was now completely liquidated. They had viciously traded my future for status, and I had systematically repossessed every single piece of their stolen kingdom, permanently leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing, inescapable weight of their own severe criminal actions. While my parents were being systematically stripped of their massive estate, Isabella was facing a brutal, terrifying reckoning entirely of her own making. The pristine, untouchable golden child had always relied on the immense wealth and unyielding protection of others to shield her from the devastating consequences of her sociopathic choices. But her final shield had just been completely shattered. Jamal did not just walk away from their marriage. He executed a flawless, aggressive legal strike that completely paralyzed her. Early Tuesday morning, just hours after the federal raid on my father's business, Isabella received a sharp knock on the heavy mahogany door of the luxury downtown penthouse she shared with Jamal. She expected to see a delivery driver, or perhaps a high society friend, coming to offer fake sympathies. Instead, she was greeted by two stern court officers and Jamal's ruthless lead attorney. They did not offer polite greetings. They handed her a thick stack of expedited legal documents. The paperwork explicitly detailed a comprehensive emergency injunction. Jamal had successfully petitioned a federal judge to permanently freeze every single joint bank account, investment portfolio, and credit line attached to her name. The judge granted the aggressive injunction immediately based on the undeniable, heavily documented evidence of her severe corporate embezzlement and financial fraud. Isabella stared at the documents in absolute horror. She desperately tried to log into her banking applications on her smartphone, frantically tapping the screen with shaking fingers, only to watch every single balance display a terrifying red zero. She was completely locked out. Jamal had legally severed her access to his massive medical fortune, leaving her entirely penniless in a matter of seconds. The financial blockade was merely the first phase of her absolute dethroning. The luxury penthouse she was currently standing inside was solely owned by Jamal prior to their marriage. Because she was actively facing felony charges for stealing from his private medical practice, the emergency court order demanded she vacate the premises immediately. The court officers gave her exactly 1 hour to pack a single suitcase of basic personal necessities. Isabella shrieked and threw a massive, unhinged tantrum demanding to speak to Jamal and threatening to call the police. The officers remained entirely unmoved by her theatrical performance. They bluntly informed her that the police were already investigating her for grand larceny and suggested she comply before she was physically removed in handcuffs. Panic finally pierced her deep delusion. She scrambled through her massive walk-in closet, violently shoving designer dresses and expensive jewelry into a leather suitcase, weeping uncontrollably as the reality of her sudden poverty crashed over her. When the hour was up, building security escorted her out of the glittering lobby. She stood on the busy city sidewalk, clutching her single suitcase, desperately calling her wealthy friends for a place to stay. Every single person forwarded her calls straight to voicemail. The viral scandal from the rehearsal dinner had transformed her into a massive social pariah. Nobody in the elite circles wanted to be associated with a disgraced, fraudulent child abandoner, facing imminent federal prison time. With her high society network completely severed and her husband permanently gone, Isabella had no choice but to seek refuge with the only people as universally despised as she was. She dragged her heavy suitcase onto a public bus and rode to the gritty city outskirts. She arrived at a cheap run-down roadside motel where Richard and Patricia had rented a cramped, foul-smelling room using the very last of their emergency cash reserves. The reunion between the golden child and her toxic enablers was utterly miserable. There was no luxurious dining room, no crystal chandeliers, and no servants to wait on them hand and foot. The three of them were crammed into a single dingy motel room with peeling wallpaper, a flickering fluorescent light, and a rusted mini-fridge. The psychological breakdown of the family unit was immediate and violently toxic. Without my success to envy and my independence to crush, they completely turned on each other. Richard spent his days screaming at Isabella, blaming her insatiable greed and reckless embezzlement for drawing the federal investigators directly to his doorstep. Isabella shrieked right back, accusing her parents of being pathetic failures who ruined her life by forcing her to attend that disastrous rehearsal dinner. Patricia simply sat on a stained floral bedspread, sobbing uncontrollably as she scrolled through local society blogs that relentlessly mocked their total financial and social annihilation. They were trapped in a suffocating, squalid prison of their own making, completely stripped of the wealth they once used to terrorize the world. Sheer survival quickly forced Isabella to do something beneath her dignity. With her embezzlement trial looming and legal fees piling up, she was forced to seek employment. The woman who once sipped champagne and mocked working-class people was abruptly hired as a minimum-wage cashier at a discount retail store. Her ultimate humiliation arrived a few weeks into her new job. Wealthy women from her former country club walked into the store looking for cheap party supplies. They instantly recognized Isabella behind the rusted cash register. They did not look away. They stood in her lane, openly laughing and taking photos on their phones to document the spectacular downfall of the city's most arrogant socialite. Isabella stood perfectly still, swallowing her fierce pride and bagging their discounted items while fighting back hot tears of absolute humiliation. She returned to the dingy motel every night, her spirit completely crushed, only to listen to her parents bickering over canned soup. They were entirely isolated and utterly broke. There was no one left to manipulate, no scapegoat to abuse, and absolutely no way to escape the brutal reality that they were about to spend the next several years serving time in a federal penitentiary. The golden child was dead, buried under the massive weight of her own criminal arrogance, and there was no one left coming to save her now. While they were rotting away in that suffocating motel room, waiting for the federal prosecutors to finalize their prison sentences, I was standing on the edge of a pristine, sunlit beach. It was the morning of my actual wedding day. The contrast between my reality and theirs was absolute. I was breathing in the clean, salty ocean air, completely free from the heavy, toxic smog that had choked my entire childhood. We had chosen a private, secluded cove for the ceremony, entirely inaccessible to uninvited guests, paparazzi, or high society gossips. There were no grand crystal chandeliers or pretentious floral arrangements designed to impress people we secretly despised. We traded the suffocating expectations of the elite country club world for the soothing rhythmic sound of gentle waves crashing against the white sand. There was not a single toxic family member present. My phone was not ringing with hysterical extortion attempts or manipulative threats. The guest list was meticulously curated, consisting only of people who had proven their unwavering loyalty and genuine love. Harrison's family welcomed me with open arms, treating me with the profound respect and warmth my own biological parents had actively denied me. My closest friends and trusted corporate partners filled the elegantly simple wooden chairs set up along the shoreline. Right in the very front row, sitting in the places of highest honor, were Jamal and Lily. Jamal looked incredibly relaxed, the heavy burden of Isabella's constant manipulation entirely lifted from his shoulders. He was smiling, a genuine, effortless expression that suited him perfectly. Sitting right beside him, Lily looked absolutely radiant in a pale blue dress. Monica sat on her other side, her eyes shining with proud maternal tears. Lily was thriving completely untethered from the dark, ugly secrets my parents had tried to bury her under. Watching the three of them chat and laugh together, free from the venomous grip of my former family, validated every single ruthless decision Harrison and I had made. We did not just protect ourselves, we liberated the casualties of their collateral damage. The music began to play, a soft acoustic melody that drifted perfectly over the ocean breeze. I did not have a father to walk me down the aisle. I did not want one. I walked myself down the white sandy path, my head held high, projecting the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had fought through hell to claim her own destiny. I wore a sleek, elegant gown that flowed beautifully in the coastal wind, entirely devoid of the heavy, performative extravagance my mother would have demanded. At the end of the aisle stood Harrison. He looked breathtaking in a tailored linen suit, his eyes locked onto mine with that same fierce, protective devotion he had shown at the steakhouse. As I took his hands at the altar, I felt an overwhelming surge of absolute peace. Our vows were not theatrical promises made for an audience. They were quiet, powerful commitments spoken directly to each other. We promised to always be each other's safest harbor and strongest shield. We promised to build a family rooted in radical honesty, uncompromising loyalty, and unconditional love. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, the cheers from our chosen family echoed across the private beach. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated victory. The reception that evening was an intimate, joyful celebration under a canopy of glowing string lights and a brilliant tapestry of stars. We ate incredible food, drank exceptional wine, and danced barefoot in the sand. There was no walking on eggshells. There was no waiting for the inevitable public humiliation or cruel backhanded compliment. For the first time in my 33 years of life, I was existing in a space completely devoid of poison. During the toasts, Jamal stood up and raised his glass. He did not speak about the dark scandal that brought us together. He simply toasted to the beauty of fresh starts, the strength required to demand the truth, and the profound joy of finding your real tribe. Lily clapped the loudest, her bright, unburdened laughter ringing out into the night. Later in the evening, I stepped away from the crowded dance floor and walked down to the edge of the water. The cool ocean washed over my bare feet as I looked out at the vast, endless horizon. Harrison walked up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the tide. I reflected on the brutal, chaotic journey that had brought me to this exact moment. For my entire life, I had allowed my parents and my sister to convince me that I was a broken, defective disappointment. I had accepted their cruelty because society conditions us to believe that blood automatically equals unshakable loyalty. But blood is just biology. True loyalty is built through consistent respect, fierce protection, and mutual care. I had to become ruthless to survive them. I had to orchestrate a flawlessly executed, merciless downfall to permanently sever the chains they had wrapped around my neck. Some people might view my retaliation as incredibly cold or unforgiving. But when a garden is being systematically choked to death by invasive toxic weeds, you do not try to negotiate with the poison. You rip it out entirely by the roots. You aggressively purge the soil so the healthy, beautiful plants finally have the space and sunlight they need to grow. I cut out the poison, and in return, I was rewarded with the most spectacular flourishing life I could have ever imagined. I looked down at the gold wedding, shining on my finger, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of triumph. My past was permanently closed and my future was brilliantly, limitlessly mine. I turned away from the dark ocean and looked directly back at the glowing lights of my perfect wedding reception, surrounded by the incredible family I had chosen for myself. Sometimes the people who try to bury you do not realize you are a seed. Have you ever had to orchestrate the perfect downfall for a toxic family member? Share your story in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power and demanding the justice you deserve.